There is a name that has been whispered in the darkest corners of despair for 900 years. A name that thieves have cried out in the middle of a robbery and suddenly dropped their blades. A name that drowning sailors have called across raging waters and found the sea grow still. That name is Abdul Qadir Jilani. And what you are about to hear is not simply the story of a man. It is the story of a rank so elevated, so mysterious, so debated among scholars and saints alike, that even 9 centuries later, people still argue over what it truly means to be called Gauth al-Azam, the greatest helper, the highest station a servant of God is believed to reach in this world. Picture Baghdad in the 12th century. The city is the beating heart of the Islamic world, a place of scholars, poets, judges, and mystics, where knowledge flows through its streets like the Tigris flows beside it. Into this city walked an 18-year-old boy from a distant province called Gilan, on the edge of the Caspian Sea, in what is today northern Iran. He carried little more than the clothes on his back and a fierce hunger to learn. He did not know, could not have known, that Baghdad would one day speak of him the way it spoke of its greatest caliphs and its greatest saints, and that his tomb would become one of the most visited graves on earth. His full name was Muhi al-Din Abu Muhammad Abdul Qadir ibn Abi Salih al-Jilani. Muhi al-Din means the reviver of the faith, a title that itself tells you something extraordinary was expected of this young man before he had even proven himself. He was born, according to the accounts passed down through generations, on the 1st of Ramadan in the year 470 after the Hijrah, which corresponds to the year 1077 of the Common Era. His mother, known as Fatima, was said to be a woman of deep piety, and his maternal grandfather was himself a respected spiritual figure in Gilan. From the very beginning, the family around him was described as a household soaked in devotion, a household where prayer was not a duty but a way of breathing. Now here is where the story begins to lift off the page of ordinary history and enter the realm that generations of believers hold sacred. According to the traditional accounts recorded by his students and later biographers, signs of something unusual followed him from birth. It is narrated that even as an infant, during the fasting month of Ramadan, he would not nurse from his mother between dawn and sunset, as though his tiny body already understood the sanctity of the fast before his mind ever could. Whether one reads this as literal history or as the poetic language later generations used to describe a soul destined for greatness, the message embedded within it is the same. This was a child marked from the cradle. When he arrived in Baghdad as a young man, he entered a city bursting with the finest teachers of Islamic law, theology, and the science of hadith. He studied under towering scholars of his time, men whose names are still cited in the footnotes of Islamic scholarship today, learning jurisprudence according to the Hanbali school of thought, grammar, literature, and the sacred texts. But scholarship alone was not what set him apart. Baghdad already had thousands of brilliant jurists. What set Abdul Qadir apart was what happened after the books were closed, when the lamps were dimmed and the city slept. It is said that he wandered restless, searching for something the books could describe but could not deliver. He spent years in isolation, in the wilderness outside Baghdad, denying himself comfort, denying himself sleep, denying himself food beyond the bare minimum needed to keep breathing. Some accounts describe him surviving on nothing but wild plants for years at a time. This was the era of his transformation, the years in which the brilliant young jurist became something else entirely, something the Sufi tradition calls a wali, a friend of God. One whose heart has been polished until it reflects a light that is not its own. It was during this period, tradition tells us, that he met the man who would become his first spiritual guide, a rugged and unschooled saint named Hamad al-Dabas. The story of their meeting reads like something out of scripture itself. On a cold and rain-soaked night, Abdul Qadir found himself led, as though by an invisible hand, to the door of Hamad's humble lodge. The door was shut. The lights inside were extinguished deliberately, because the teacher already knew through spiritual insight that his student was coming and wished to test him before he even crossed the threshold. Abdul Qadir sat outside in the freezing rain, and exhaustion eventually overtook him. According to the narration, he fell asleep, and in that state something happened that required him to purify himself. So he walked to the icy river in the darkness and bathed. He returned, fell asleep again, and the same thing happened. 7 times that night. In bitter cold, he rose and purified himself rather than enter his teacher's presence in anything less than complete readiness. When morning finally broke and the doors opened, his teacher embraced him with tears in his eyes and told him that good fortune belonged to them both, but that tomorrow the greater fortune would belong to Abdul Qadir alone. That single night is often told as the moment the seed of everything that followed was planted. For years afterward, he lived a hidden life, deliberately veiled from the recognition of the world, teaching in obscurity, wandering the deserts and ruins outside the city, wrestling with his own soul in a struggle that Sufi literature calls the Greater Jihad, the battle against the self. Then, in the year 521 after the Hijrah, something shifted. He returned to Baghdad and began to teach publicly. And from that point until his death 40 years later, he never stopped. He established a school which grew into what became known as the Madrasa al-Qadiriyah, a center of learning that drew students not only from Baghdad but from across the entire Islamic world. Within its walls, students studied the Quran, the sciences of Hadith, Islamic law, and the deeper science of the heart, what the Sufis call tasawwuf, the purification of the inner self. And it was here, in this final chapter of his life, that the title which forms the very center of tonight's story began to attach itself to his name, Gawth al-Azam, the greatest helper. In the framework of Sufi cosmology, a framework built over centuries by mystics attempting to describe the invisible architecture of spiritual reality, there exists a hidden hierarchy of righteous souls through whom the mercy of God is believed to flow into the world. At the summit of this hierarchy stands a single figure in every generation known as the UTB, the axis, the pole around which the spiritual world is said to turn, much as the physical world turns on its own invisible axis. And when this pole is invoked specifically in his function of answering the cries of the desperate, of rushing to the aid of those who call out in their darkest hour, he is given the title Gawth, the helper, the one who comes running when no one else can hear you. To call Abdul Qadir Jilani the Gawth al-Azam, the greatest of all helpers, is to place him, in the eyes of his devotees, at the very peak of this invisible hierarchy, not merely one saint among many but the saint whose spiritual reach is said to touch every corner of creation. It is worth pausing here to understand what this claim does and does not mean within the tradition that makes it. This is not, and was never intended to be, a claim of divinity. Islam's absolute foundation is the oneness of God, a principle so central that nothing in Islamic theology is permitted to compromise it. What the title describes instead is a station of extraordinary nearness to God, a servant so purified, so emptied of ego, so drenched in devotion, that he becomes, in the language of the mystics, a channel, a mirror, a conduit through which divine mercy is believed to reach a suffering world. His own students record him teaching that the higher a soul rises in spiritual rank, the greater its humility must become, and that true nearness to God is proven not by power but by selfless service to others. He is remembered as warning his own followers against arrogance, insisting that sainthood was never meant to elevate a man above his fellow human beings, but to make him more useful to them. The stories of his miracles, the karamat as they are called in Arabic, are almost too numerous to count, preserved across centuries in books with names like Bahjat al-Asrar, meaning the delight of secrets, compiled not long after his death by scholars who had gathered testimony from his own students and their descendants. It is recorded that he could perceive events happening far beyond his physical sight, that he warned of coming plagues and wars before they arrived, that men who came to rob him left instead as changed human beings, weeping at his feet. One tradition, recorded in these early biographical works, states that more than 500 people of other faiths accepted Islam because of what they witnessed in his presence, and that over 100,000 people who had lived lives of crime and sin returned to righteousness through his influence. Numbers this large invite the natural questions of the historian, and modern scholars examining these sources are honest about the difficulty of separating devotional legend from verifiable fact after 9 centuries of retelling. But even setting aside the exact figures, what remains undisputed by historians of every background is the sheer scale of his influence. No other single Sufi figure in history has had an order named after him that spread as widely, as durably, or as deeply as the Qadiriyah. The spiritual path built upon his teachings, which today stretches from Morocco to Indonesia, from the mountains of Kurdistan to the villages of West Africa, from the streets of Baghdad to the shores of Southeast Asia, kings, generals, and ordinary farmers alike have counted themselves among his spiritual descendants. It is recorded that even towering figures of Islamic history, such as Nur ad-Din Zangi and the legendary Salahuddin, the very general who would later reclaim Jerusalem, held him in deep respect. He left behind not only disciples but words, real, tangible words that survive to this day in his own writings. Works such as Al-Gunya li Talibi Tariq al-Haq, a guide for those seeking the path of truth, and Futu al-Ghaib, translated as Revelations of the Unseen, a collection of his sermons that still circulates today, printed and reprinted, translated into dozens of languages, read by seekers who were not even born in the same millennium as the man who spoke them. In these sermons, delivered to crowds so large that they overflowed his school and spilled into the surrounding streets. He did not speak like a man claiming supernatural authority over others. He spoke, again and again, about sincerity, about turning away from love of this fleeting world, about surrendering the self entirely to God, and about the danger of pride, even spiritual pride, even the pride of a man who believes his own good deeds have earned him something. It is a strange and humbling detail that the man history remembers as standing at the summit of sainthood spent his sermons warning his listeners, and perhaps warning himself, against the very temptation to feel superior to another human being. He passed from this world on the 11th night of the month of Rabi al-Thani in the year 561 after the Hijrah, which corresponds to February of the year 1166, at the age of 91. Multitudes gathered in Baghdad for his funeral. He was laid to rest in the city that had once received him as a penniless 18-year-old stranger, and now mourned him as one of its own sons. His tomb, destroyed at one point during the political and religious upheavals of the 16th century, was rebuilt through the order of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and it still stands in Baghdad today, drawn to by visitors of every background, day and night, nearly 900 years after his death. Each year, on the anniversary of his passing, gatherings are held across the Muslim world in a tradition often called Gyarvi Sharif, where his life, his teachings, and his legacy are remembered anew by generations who never met him but who feel, through the chain of his students and the students of his students, an unbroken thread connecting them to the man himself. It is important, in telling this story with honesty, to acknowledge that not everyone within the Islamic tradition has embraced every element of the devotion that grew around his name. Reform-minded voices across Islamic history have at times raised concerns about certain popular practices associated with saint veneration, cautioning that reverence for any human being, however righteous, must never approach anything resembling worship, which belongs to God alone. Those who defend the tradition of honoring him respond that recognizing the excellence of a truly righteous soul is not worship but appreciation, the same instinct that leads any community to honor its most selfless and devoted members. This tension, debated by scholars for centuries, remains part of the honest picture of who Abdul Qadir Jilani was and what his legacy has become. But whichever side of that theological conversation one finds themselves on, what cannot be denied is the sheer weight of what this one man left behind. A boy from a remote village on the edge of the Caspian Sea walked into the greatest city of his age with nothing, spent years in silence and hunger perfecting his own soul before he ever dared to teach another, and emerged as a figure whose name is still called upon by millions of human beings across every continent on earth, 9 centuries after his final breath. Whether you read his story as history softened by legend, or as the literal unveiling of a soul brought closer to the divine than nearly any other in his age, the lesson at its core remains the same, and it is a lesson that needs no theological framework to understand. Greatness of that magnitude was never built on comfort. It was built in the cold, in the hunger, in the silence, in the years nobody was watching, when a young man chose, again and again, in the freezing dark outside a locked door, to purify himself rather than walk away. And perhaps that is the real inheritance of the man they came to call the greatest helper. Not merely the miracles attributed to him, not merely the title that placed him at the summit of an invisible hierarchy, but the simple, unyielding example of a human being who decided that nearness to God was worth more than every comfort this world had to offer, and who spent his entire life proving that decision, one freezing night, one act of humility, one selfless sermon at a time.